Hi everybody, this is Nurse Angie of Nurse Angie's Adventures and Reviews. Today we are at Woodland Cemetery and Arboretum in Dayton, Ohio, and we're going to do a tour of the History, Mystery, Mayhem, and Murder Tour. So, let's get going. If any of you are wanting to see more about this cemetery, just search my YouTube page for Woodland Cemetery, Dayton, Ohio. There is a Woodland Cemetery in Xenia, Ohio, but we're at the Woodland in Dayton. Alright, thank you for watching, and have a good day.
This is Johnny Morehouse. Johnny's dad had a cobbler shop. You know what a cobbler shop is? Make shoes, repair shoes. Along the canal that went through Dayton. There used to be a canal that went through downtown Dayton. It'd be Patterson Boulevard, the road that goes, the street that goes right past the library. It was in existence till the early part of the 1900s, and then they filled it in and made a street out of it. Well, Johnny's dad had a cobbler shop. Back in the 1860s, Johnny was 5 years old and he was playing with his dog along the canal. Johnny fell in. He could not swim. So the dog jumped in to save Johnny. The dog had trouble getting him out, finally got him out, but Johnny drowned. He died. And so they buried Johnny here. People ask, is the dog buried here too? No, but there is a dog story that goes with it. After they buried Johnny, the dog would come up here almost every day and sit at his grave, which is kind of cool. Now, there was a sculptor in Dayton called Daniel Ladau. He made this, and you notice, if you can see from all the stuff, there's a top, there's a ball, there's a mouth organ, whoops, and his hat. These things were in his pocket when he drowned. And he did a pretty good likeness of everything. Now you say, why do we have all this stuff here? Well, pennies are not unusual, or coins. I mean, nowadays you'll see nickels, dimes, quarters, but pennies, and I think it goes back, well, how many of you seen Schindler's List? At the end of the movie, when they go up to the grave and they put a little pebble on the tombstone, well, those pennies are the same way. You're saying, I was here, and you're honoring the person. And they think we got the pennies, the copper coins, because back in Greek mythology, they thought that you would have to pay the river boatmen copper coins in order to get across the river to get to eternal life. So that's why they think that came about. Now, it's funny, if you look over there, that's UD, University of Dayton. And on occasion, I will give tours of University of Dayton students. And they tell me all kinds of stories. Like at night, sometimes they'll see Johnny and the dog walking around. Now one they told me, and I wondered about, and I had to go ask the administrative people. They said on certain days, you can actually see steam coming out of the dog's nose. So I asked them about it, and they started laughing. They said, if you look closely, there are two holes here. And these go all the way down into the sculpture, and that's to release the moisture and protect the sculpture. So if the weather conditions are right, you know how sometimes you can see your breath, you can actually see steam coming out of the dogs. But as far as the University of Dayton students are concerned, many of them, this thing's haunted. The lady who's buried there, found this at a garage sale and bought it and had it placed there. I think it fits pretty well, which goes to show you that you don't have to spend a lot of money to be buried here and have some sort of monument. Lucius Rice, he was one of the first African Americans on the Dayton police force, and he joined in 1909. He was known as being a very good patrolman, a very good shot. He won some shooting tournaments. 1916, he was promoted to sergeant. 1926, he was in this gun battle with this guy, and the guy shot him in the stomach, and as he was going over, he was going down, he shot the guy dead. He ended up in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and they thought he would die, because back then if you got shot in the belly, that was a bad thing because they didn't have antiseptics. I mean, penicillin comes about later in the 1920s, but he survived it. He became a detective sergeant in the 1930s. In 1939, he and some of the other policemen were chasing the suspect, and the suspect went in this house. When they went in the house after him, Lucius went in this room, and the guy jumped out of a closet and shot him in the stomach. This time Lucius didn't survive, and he died in 1939. This is Lucia's wife, Dora, and she's kind of interesting too, because she joined the Dayton Police Force in the 1920s, and her specialty was dealing with children and troubled juveniles type of things. And I think it's kind of interesting that you had a couple who worked for the Dayton Police Department. Cat, and she lived near here. She had a son that lived with her, older son, and a daughter. I think the daughter, her name was Christine, and she was about 18 years old. Well, the story is the son came home from work one day, walks in the kitchen, and finds Christine, the daughter, on the kitchen floor with her head bashed in and blood all around. She was dead. So he calls for help, the police come, the coroner comes. The first suspect they have is the son, but the coroner says, no, this body's been here a while, and they were able to prove that the son had been at work. As they looked at the body, the one thing they found interesting was there was some gunpowder on her cheek, and they couldn't figure it out because she had no bullet holes in her. They talked to the son. He says, well, I do have a revolver upstairs in a chest, but the last time I used it was like New Year's Eve. I shot it in the air. They couldn't figure that out. They pursued a bunch of suspects. This girl had a boyfriend, but his story checked out. They saw this strange man walking in the neighborhood. He checked out. So this became an unsolved mystery. Oh, I forgot to tell you one part. When everybody's there and they're looking at the body, the mother came in all dressed up, and of course she went in hysterics. Of course she knew nothing about it. So this was an unsolved mystery. 17 years later, when she was on her deathbed, she called her son in and said, I have to tell you something. I killed Christine. She said, it was lunchtime and I wanted her to make the biscuits, and she laughed at me and was walking out the door. So I picked up a short-handled axe and beat her in the head. Then she said, I panicked, so I went upstairs and got some gunpowder out of your chest, put it on Christine's cheek. I don't know what that was supposed to do. And then, now she's becoming more rational about this thing. She decides to dress up and go to downtown Dayton so she has an alibi, which she did. So she dies. But before she dies, she tells the son, you're to tell no one until you're on your deathbed. Well, he couldn't wait. After she died, in a matter of days, he told the newspaper, he told the police, so they finally solved the unsolved mystery. I think it's interesting. People say, well, where's Christine buried? We don't know. She possibly could be in our potter's field, and I'm going to show you the potter's field. And I think it's also interesting that the son isn't around either. So I can understand where maybe the son didn't think well of his mom after he heard that story, so I don't know. But that's the story of Christine Kett, also known as Dayton Slim. Why do you think they called him Dayton Slim? Because he was really skinny, okay? He was kind of a bad guy. He was involved with the Cook gang. In fact, he dated their sister, Rose Cook. To show you the type of stuff he'd be involved in, one time they had, this is like 1900, 1901, about that time period. They had all this copper wire at the Springfield Fairgrounds. You know, that this is the time they're putting telephone wires up and that sort of thing. Well, the Cook gang tried to steal a copper wire, and the police came in and there was a big shootout. That's the type of stuff that happened. But the story that goes with Dayton Slim is, there used to be this feed and grain store on Wayne Avenue, and there was the manager was Joseph Scheid, and there were 3 guys working one night, and they're closing up the feed and grain store, and they look at the front door, and there's 2 guys with masks on with guns pointed at them. So obviously they had to unlock the door and let them in. So they tell Joseph Scheid, the manager, we want the keys to the safe. He says, no, I'm not going to give them to you. They argued, said no, and finally one of the thieves, shot him in the leg. As he went down to grab his leg, I don't know if they panicked or what, but they shot again. This time went through his heart. He dropped dead. So they go to the next person, gives the keys for the safe. They were a lot more cooperative, let's say. They gave him the keys to the safe, but they had trouble getting the safe open. Now they're getting worried because there had been 2 shots. They can't get the safe open, so they hightail it out of there. At the same time this was going on, there's a little girl who was taking her father his dinner. He worked at the Lowe paint factory on Wayne Avenue, and she was taking the dinner, and she saw these 2 guys that were kind of in this alleyway, and she thought they were suspicious. So when she saw the police, she told them, she gave a description, and the police go, that's Dayton Slim, just from the description. So they decide they're going to try to find Dayton Slim because they can't find him anyplace. They put some detectives on Rose Cook's apartment and wait to see if he'll show up there. He doesn't, but she takes a package to some person that was not Dayton Slim to New Orleans. And so they called the New Orleans police and they say, hey, watch for this package at the post office. Whoever picks it up, that's got to be Dayton Slim. So lo and behold, there's this guy who picks up the package. They arrest him, but it isn't Dayton Slim. They find out later that Dayton Slim was down the street watching and paid this guy to pick up the package. Smart guy. Well, anyhow, Dayton Slim disappears again. This time, Rose Cook also disappears. So they decide to put some detectives on the mother's house, the mother of Dayton Slim. So they watch, and you know what? She does a similar thing. She gets a package, has a name they don't recognize, and sends it to Denver. This time, some Dayton detectives go to Denver, they watch, and Dayton Slim picks it up. This time they arrest him, they arrest Rose. They bring him back. When they question Rose, she does not say a word, and she's called the woman of silence. They question Dayton Slim, and it's like, I had nothing to do with it. I did not do anything with it. Well, the murder took place in 1902. If you look, he died in 1904. He was electrocuted in 1904. That's how fast things went. He was convicted of it. But before he died, he was on the electric chair. He said, I would like to say a few words, and they said, sure, go ahead. Well, he cursed out the judge, cursed out the prosecutor. He didn't have good things to say about anybody, and he said, I am totally innocent, and they killed him. Every so often, I don't know if you've attended one of these, but they will have recreations of courtroom scenes in Dayton or cases, and they have them down at the old courthouse. But they actually have a jury. Well, this one was, they did this a few years ago, and they declared him innocent. And the reason why is there wasn't enough evidence. I mean, if you think about it, it was only on a little girl's description and a skinny guy, and they thought it was Dayton Slim. So that's the story of Dayton Slim. Now, what's interesting is this story went on further and further because it was rumored that the other person in the robbery was Rose Cook dressed up as a man, but they never were able to prove it. Professor on Back to the Future, this is what this guy reminds me of. If you've been to the dentist lately, you can thank L.L. Custer because he came up with the electric dentist drill. He also came up with the bubble statoscope, which would tell aircraft how high and how low they were. And from what I understand, hot air balloons still use a version of the statoscope today. He also came up with electric little cars that you use in amusement parks, kind of like the bumper cars. Also came up with a little electric boat. The one I really like is after World War I, you had a lot of guys who either had spinal cord injuries or lost legs, and he came up with the Custer car. It was a three-wheel vehicle, it was electric, and it was kind of like what you would say is an electric wheelchair they use. The one invention that he had, in the 1950s, he went to the Dayton school board. He says, I want you to adopt my invention. And it's like, what is it? He came up with the electric whipping machine. Now, believe it or not, the Dayton school board said, no, we want nothing to do with this. He had like a 4-story factory near where Chaminade Julienne is now. And it burnt down in the 1960s, and I hate that because I'd love to see the plans for an electric whipping machine, how that worked. But this thing was like Silicon Valley because on the top floor he had a miniature golf course. On another floor he had aquariums. So, I mean, it sounds like a really interesting place. And what's interesting, one time I gave a talk at a church about and told about him. And I had this lady come up and say, well, I'm his niece. And it's like, are you kidding me? So he did exist. Now, if you turn around, you see this big bare area? This is the equivalent of the Potter's Field. There's over 1,000 people buried here, and we often know who's buried here, but we don't know the location. For instance, Paul and Lawrence Dunbar's little sister, when she died, is buried here. You know she's in that field, you don't know where. Now I'm going to tell you about 2 people that are in there. One is Joseph Leslie. This story took place in 1866. Joseph fell in love with this 18-year-old in New Lebanon, Ohio. And he wanted to take her out in the worst way, and her mother said no. She didn't like the guy. So he did probably what we would call stalking, because he took a room in a hotel right across the street where they live, and even had a room that overlooked their house, which I think is a little creepy. Well, the mother would still refuse to let her daughter go out with him. So one day the mother came home from a walk, went on the porch and was knitting, and he took a gun out of his room, a revolver, and opened the window, shot her, and she fell over dead. Well, the police came in, and of course he denied it, but they found a 6-shooter in his room with 1 bullet missing. They also found all this gunpowder residue around the window. So he was convicted. At first people thought he would be hung for the crime, but he was sent to the Ohio State Penitentiary for 10 years. When he got out, he went to the soldiers' home, which we call the VA Center, and so which makes me think he must have been like a soldier in the Civil War or something like that. Stayed there for a while and then got out. Was just very despondent about how his life turned out. Tried to kill himself by shooting himself in the stomach. Didn't work, believe it or not. After I tell you all this thing, how people died from stomach wounds, he lived. He later was able to commit suicide by taking poison. But what I think is interesting is his death made the New York Tribune. And this is what the headline says. A murderer commits suicide. Joseph Leslie, a worthless character, committed suicide by poisoning himself. So he did make it in the New York Tribune. Another person buried here, and this story takes place in the 1890s, it's Maggie Layman. Now, Maggie Layman was a chambermaid at a big boarding house called the Abbey. The Abbey was a boarding house, but it was also maybe what you call a house of ill repute. And Maggie decided to, I love this, I read this today in fact, which is kind of funny, it said during the night she would entertain lonely men. So she would do this, but she had 4 kids. She had a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. Well, the neighbors complained because she'd leave them alone at night. So they took all her kids away. She got involved with this guy, always got to look at his name, Jacob Harvey. And he was a pimp and a thief. And at the time she got involved with him, she wanted to get her kids back. And she was in the process of getting her daughter back. She had 1 daughter and 3 sons. And he got mad and beat her up. She reported to the police. He went to jail. Well, when he got out of jail, he came back, and she wanted nothing to do with him because she's trying to get her life right. So she made up this story that she was dating the bartender at the Abbey, and he actually went along with it. Well, this Jacob Harvey got so mad, he beat her to almost to the point of death. He goes back to jail again. But when he's in jail, he tells everybody, when I get out, I'm going to get a gun, and I'm going to shoot her, and I'm going to shoot the bartender. Well, guess what? He escapes from jail, goes to his brother's house, gets a gun, and the story is there was a guy walking along the front, in front of the Abbey, and he heard the screaming. Jacob Harvey's pulling Maggie out by her hair on the porch, takes the gun, shoots her in the head, then walks away, goes down to the bar, gets a beer, and tells the bartender, I shot her. Well, needless to say, they killed him by hanging. He didn't get away with that murder. I always wondered what happened to the kids though, because I could never find out what happened to them. Did they go to family? Did they go to an orphanage? There was no more mention of the kids, which is kind of a sad story. Colonel Edward Deeds. Colonel Deeds was born in Granville, Ohio in 1874. Granville is the home of Denison University. In fact, he graduated from Denison, went to Cornell for graduate study in electrical engineering. He was hired by John Patterson for NCR, and his job was to oversee electrifying the cash register, because up that time the cash register was purely mechanical, and he electrified it. While he was there, he met Charles Kettering, who was another engineer, and he and Charles used to work on projects on the side. At this time period, when you had cars, you had to crank them to start them, which is very dangerous. They thought it'd be great if they came up with an electric starter, and they did. And the Cadillac company wanted to put their electric starter in the 1912 Cadillac. Now I find this fascinating because they sold it to them. There's thousands of orders, and they didn't have a factory. So they had to start a factory and everything, and they called their company Delco. So they became very rich. 1913, do you remember what happened in Dayton in 1913? 1913 flood. Well, Colonel Deeds was one of the people who was one of the leaders in organizing the Miami Conservancy District and raising the money to make the dams so we wouldn't have the floods like we used to. During World War I, the United States really didn't have its own planes. When our guys went over originally, they would use British planes or French planes. He was come up with an American plane, which he worked on, but the war ended before it really became utilized. In the 1920s, he was CEO of the sugar company, actually a sugar conglomerate that was based in Cuba. The guy made a lot of money. He had a big house south of Dayton, had one of the first private landing strips in the United States, had an observatory. Very interesting guy. But what I think's funny about the whole thing, and funny in an odd way, is when people are first buried here, sometimes you'll see these little medallions, and that means it's perpetual care. They paid extra money to go into this fund that the cemetery said we will constantly watch over, care for your grave. But at first, people could make the decision, no, I'm not going to pay into that, and it's the family's responsibility. Well, this is one where it's the family's responsibility. And if you look to the left-hand side, see that crack up there? It's kind of In fact, it goes all the way up. The cemetery is concerned about it because the family's supposed to take care of it. They need to have some sort of engineering study done because they're afraid. Occasionally there's earthquakes in this area. If we have an earthquake or something, that whole site could fall off. His only living relative, as far as I know, is his grandson in New York. And grandson's not responding, which I think is interesting. Another story, deeds, if you go into Caroline Park, he donated the land for it. He also, the deeds Caroline. And the way the Deeds Caroline came about was he and his wife went to Belgium. She heard of Caroline and she said, Edward, I want one of those. And he said, yes, dear, and made this Caroline. All the bells are named after family members. Now, you see this huge thing, you look over here, James Middleton Cox, which is reasonable size. Do you know who Cox was? You ever hear Cox Enterprises? That was the Cox. He started the Dayton Daily News. He actually was buying a newspaper that became the Dayton Daily News. And when he went to get a loan, banks would turn him down. They said, it's too risky. We're not doing it. Made him so mad that when he finally got money, if you've seen the old Dayton Daily newspaper office in downtown Dayton, it looks like this is very ornate. It looks like an old bank. He wanted it to look like an old bank. He says, I want it to look like it could last forever. He was governor of Ohio, also ran for president in 1920 against Warren G. Harding. Do you know who his vice president was? Vice presidential running mate? FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was his vice presidential running mate. This is Langstroth. It's Lorenzo Langstroth, and all those words. He came to actually where Miami University is, Oxford, Ohio, in 1852. He graduated from Yale back in the 1830s, but he came up with what we would call as the modern beehive, all the inventions for that. And it's funny because when I had the beekeepers here, they went back, had their pictures taken with it, were touching it. I mean, they thought it was the coolest thing. This one right here, some people call the fallen angel, the one says Richter. Now this is really interesting, because this is Madam Richter. Her working name before she became a madam was Lib Hedges. In fact, remember I told you about the Abbey? She got that house at one time and she renamed it Hedgewood. So we've got that house associated with that murder. Now we have this house associated with Elizabeth Richter. Her sister's working name was Lou Fontaine. Now, as you can tell, she was what you would call a woman of ill repute. However, she took really good care of her girls. She provided good medical care. If any guys would get rough or even rough language, she would ban them from the house. You have some graves over there that the girls only had one name, like Maud, and she would bury them there. She owned at any given time, between 100 and 150 houses in Dayton. Not houses of ill repute, but houses that she'd rent out and that sort of thing. She had a lot of land and a lot of real estate. If one of her girls got married, she would very often give them a house as a wedding gift, which I think was kind of cool. During the 1913 flood, a lot of her properties were damaged, and they came to her because they were raising money to rebuild Dayton. And she says, I can't believe you're approaching me. I probably lost more property in Dayton than any private landowner. But she ended up giving the largest private gift of anybody for flood relief. The one story I find kind of interesting, excuse me, 1915, city of Dayton banned her profession, and she just went back to being Elizabeth Richter. But before she died, she came to Woodland Cemetery and wanted to donate a lot of money to the foundation. Trustees met and they wouldn't take it because they said because of her profession that was dirty money and they wouldn't take it. And I've often wondered how much money was she willing to give and how much would that be worth now if they had taken it. Second tallest, that one right there, Meade, used to be the tallest one. But there was a storm in the summertime and a tree came down, knocked it over, and broke it. So really what you're seeing is just the top of that obelisk. Mead is the Meads that had the Mead Paper Company. And back in there, there's a little 10-year-old buried back in there, and this story took place in the 1890s, Eliza Mead. And her parents were Christian scientists. Any Christian scientists here? Okay. They really didn't want to do regular medical care because they felt you could heal yourself through your mind and that sort of thing. So Eliza became very sick, and they had her stay with a Christian Scientist healer, and all he did was give her beef tea and water. Well, she died. Well, a lot of people in the city of Dayton went nuts over this because they felt that they had neglected her care and she had died. So they arrested the healer and everything. Well, they ended up having an autopsy up here. That sounds weird, doesn't it? But they would do that back in the old days. Sometimes they'd have an autopsy in the cemetery. And they had the autopsy, and they had some doctors look at her, and they decided that she had died from meningitis. And then the discussion was, could she have survived? And they came down on no, she couldn't have. It wouldn't have mattered. So they released the guy, but that's the story. As we walk past the tallest obelisk, look on it, there's a picture of this locomotive. Because the guy here used to be a locomotive engineer, and he later owned a railway company. One of the most famous poets, he was a Dayton native, probably the first internationally known African-American poet. And see the little gravestone there? That's in tribute to his sister. His sister's not buried there, but they put that there. His mom's buried right behind him. What's interesting about Paul, he died at 33 years old from tuberculosis. And even though he was internationally known, he didn't have a lot of money. I mean, he was okay. He wasn't starving or anything. Didn't have a lot of money. So he's buried in a poor section, what we consider a poor section. Well, he went to school with Orville Wright. They were good friends, and he used to hang around with Orville and Wilbur at their bicycle shop. There's a story where on their back wall he wrote a little poem and everything. Well, when he died and was buried down there, Orville had a fit, saying, how can that be? He was internationally known. Orville paid to have his body and his grave moved up here. Only, which I think is interesting, only a stone throw away from the Wright brothers, which I think is kind of a cool story. Down there is Maurice Desjardins. Maurice Desjardins was French-Canadian, and he was a French-Canadian bank robber. And he spent time in jail. He had a family. He had a wife and some kids, but he decided to make a new start. So he came by himself to the United States, to Dayton. This is the end of the 1950s, early part of the 1960s. Now, this is the fascinating part. He is employed by an electrical company that puts in bank alarms. Obviously, they did not do background checks back then. So there was a new bank in Centerville, and he helped install the bank alarm. Well, he knew that if they pressed the button in case of robbery, he had at least 5 minutes. So he, after the bank opens, he puts on a ball cap, sunglasses, floppy clothes, goes in, robs the bank. He does very well. He's not smart with his money, but he got a lot of money. In fact, he went out, bought a new yellow Oldsmobile with cash at the dealership. Took a lot of the rest of the money and gambled it all away on horses. When his friends would ask, how did you get all the money? He says, well, I invested well in gold mines. So when he ran out of money, he said, well, it worked the first time, why don't I try it a second time? So he does it again, gets away with it again, does the same thing, gambles away all the money. So this is just a few months later. So now we're down the road, and he says, well, why not? So he goes in again. Now the bank's a little bit smarter. Now they have some packages of marked bills. They also hire a bank guard. So he goes in to do it. robs the bank, is going out the back door. The bank guard comes out, shoots him in the leg. Well, they go chasing after him. He gets away from him, but his leg's a mess. I mean, he has blood all over it and everything. He finds his house that the door's open. So he goes in, goes up the steps, and he finds some men's clothes. So he changes clothes. While he's changing clothes, he hears voices downstairs. It ends up being a mother and her daughter. Well, he panics, so he takes all the money, puts it in a bag, and sticks it in the closet, and walks calmly down the steps. And the mother says, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" And he says, "Oh, there's a bank robbery and I'm with the FBI and we're looking for the robber," and walks out the back door. Mother didn't believe this, tells the police. They catch him. They put him in the Dayton jail. He is very despondent because he's embarrassed because his friends thought he got all this money from gold mines and everything. He's embarrassed for his family. So Maurice takes his bed sheet and hangs himself on, like you have a horizontal rail at the jail, hung himself and kills himself. Well, he's buried down there, and they actually put a gravestone down there, somebody did, and they wrote this poem for him that's on his grave. I went down there and looked at it, it's actually there. This is what it says. "This limerick's for poor Maurice, who 2 times avoided the police. When he tried again, his greed did him in. Now he lies in this grave. Rest in peace." In 1867, Samuel Tate was walking across the Main Street Bridge. Guy came up to him. I don't know why all these stories end up this way. Shot him in the stomach. He falls down. The guy takes his money, takes the keys to his office, and runs away. Well, people come, they try to help Samuel. They take him to a doctor's office, and the doctor said, well, with a gut shot like this, he's probably not going to last the night. But Samuel Tate actually lived 30 more years and was one of the organizers for the Dayton View Bridge. And if you ever get a chance sometime and look, he's got a beautiful gravestone that was carved by Daniel Ladau, the same one did Johnny Morehouse. Nelson Driggs. Now, Nelson Driggs lived in the boarding house that used to be known as the Abbey or the Hedgewood. But when he lived in it, it was no longer a house of ill repute, it was just a boarding house. Well, the police raided his place and they found $40,000 in counterfeit $10 bills. Because Nelson was a counterfeiter. He had been a counterfeiter his whole life. But I don't think that's the most interesting part of the story. I think the interesting part was he was 83 years old when they did this. Never found the plates, and I'm recently retired, and one of the things they keep telling me is, you gotta stay active, you gotta stay active. Well, Nelson stayed active, but I don't think he should have been in that type of activity. And he died in 1897. And Julius had a butcher shop on Brown Street, and one night his wife and her sister picked him up in a one-horse carriage. It was covered, and he just crawled in the back and his wife drove. They got up on Beavertown Pike, which now we know as Wilmington Avenue, and there was this big haystack and 3 guys jumped out from behind it. One guy grabbed the horse, the other 2 guys had guns and they were robbing them. The women started screaming. I think Julius probably fell asleep because he stood up all of a sudden like, what's going on? And it surprised the robbers because they didn't know he was back there, shot him and killed him. Well, they ran away, the murderers ran away. Neighbors came, helped them, but this is the oldest unsolved mystery in Dayton history. We do not know who killed Julius Cruz. That's one of those is Ada Lance. Ada was 12 years old, and again it was in the 1890s. There was last part of the 1890s. Her father was having a birthday party, and she went out to the carriage house to get his birthday present. Ada never came back in. Well, they started looking for her. They got the neighbors. They searched, and they searched. They finally found her Her body was in the bottom of the outhouse. She had been strangled and thrown in the bottom of the outhouse. Well, this was one of 5 murders that happened around this time, and all these girls were young girls, and they were strangled and killed. So Ada Lance, they never did find the murderer, but she was the one of those 5 murders. Now, I have a theory about this. Ask me when we get to the what's the last one called Oliver Hoff. If I forget, make sure you ask me how this could be connected with Ada. Taking the stake away, it's Bessie Little. Bessie Little is an interesting story because she was like 18, and this is the story. It was in the summer, and this guy came up from Cincinnati, and it was really, really hot. So he went to the Dayton Canoe Club and jumped in the river there and was swimming, and he thought he saw a branch sticking up, so he swam over to it and grabbed it. It was a woman's leg. Well, they pulled it out, and the police didn't know who she was. The coroner looked at her and says, I don't think there was foul play involved. So they buried her in the potter's field. Remember when I told you about the potter's field? So they put out a description of her where this guy who was working in a hotel said, that's Bessie Little. That sounds like Bessie Little because she worked here and she hadn't shown up. So he told the police went to her parents and said, why didn't you report your daughter missing? And they said, well, she became pregnant by her boyfriend and we kicked her out and we disowned her. So they look up the boyfriend. I think his name was Alfred Franz. And Alfred tells a story that he had Bessie in his carriage and they came up on the Ridge Avenue Bridge over the Stillwater River, and she wanted him to marry her because she was pregnant, and he said no, and he said she took his gun and shot herself in the head. Well, he was so panicked because he thought he'd be blamed that he threw the gun in the river, threw her body in the river. And later when they investigated, they did find bloodstains on the Ridge Avenue Bridge. So they decided, well, we need to dig up her body and check again. So they dug up her body, did another autopsy. Lo and behold, they find 2 bullet holes in her head, in her temple. Well, this goes to court. Of course, his side said, well, yeah, somebody can shoot themselves twice in the head. And of course, doctors said, no, 1 shot and you're dead. That's it. So he was convicted. And it was interesting because they even brought in her skull into the courtroom to show the 2 bullet holes. Well, he was sent to the electric chair, but remember, this is the early days of the electric chair. It took them 3 times to kill him, and I guess it was pretty gruesome when they did. Now, Bessie's parents kind of had second thoughts, so they felt bad, so they had her dug up from there and moved down to here. By the way, this was considered kind of the poorer section. That's where Paul Lawrence Dunbar was buried originally. Why? Because it's not up on a hill with good views and everything. In here, and his wife Amanda Anderson, they were slaves prior to the Civil War. You ever hear of Winter's Bank? You remember Winter's Bank? There used to be a Winter's Bank downtown. In fact, what do they call it? The Stratocash Tower. It used to be the Kettering Tower. That was originally the Winter's Bank Tower. And Valentine Winters was the founder of that bank. Well, his son-in-law fought in the Union Army, and at the end of the Civil War, he came across Jordan and Amanda down south when they were freed, and he helped them get back up to Dayton. They actually worked for Valentine Winter as a housekeeper and that sort of thing. Well, Jordan's old slave owner wrote him a letter and said, I need help. Can you come back and work for me? Which I can't believe he did that. So Valentine, he couldn't read or write, but he dictated the letter to Valentine Winters, and Valentine wrote the letter, and basically what he said is, I will only consider it if you give me all the back pay. Figured up all the hours he owed him, how much per hour and how much money it would be. He never heard from the slave owner ever again. But the interesting part of this story is their son they named Valentine. And that's him right here, who became a medical doctor, which I think, what an amazing story. They could not read or write, ex-slaves. By the time he got to the next generation, he became a very respected medical doctor. Parents of Oliver Ha. Remember I talked to you about Oliver Ha? It was his parents and his brother. Now, Oliver Ha, believe it or not, was a medical doctor. He had a family, he had a wife, he had kids. He was located in Dayton originally, but he was a terrible doctor. Now, the reason he was probably a terrible doctor is because he was a morphine addict. They said he had holes all up and down his arm from needle holes. And he also would take part in cocaine once in a while. He would go to the Dayton State Hospital, because back then if you had a drug addiction or an alcohol problem, even though it was a mental hospital, you could go there to dry out, and he would do that, but it didn't work. He ended up, he was so bad, he would have to move around the Midwest, leave his wife and family here, move around the Midwest, open up a doctor's office, but he could only stay in one place 2 or 3 years because they found out he was a terrible doctor. Well, one of the things he was suspected of doing, if he had a patient who was very ill, he was just inject them with something to kill him. The other thing he did that wasn't too cool was, I know at least in one case, he married another woman where he's still married to his wife down here. So this guy was a real piece of work. It got so bad, he finally had to move in with his parents and his brother. And they had a farm on Dixie Drive, just south of Vandalia. And the story is that one night about 1 o'clock in the morning, one of the neighbors heard this pounding his door, and he opened up the door and there's Oliver. And Oliver says, "Our house is on fire, our house is on fire." So they go down. The neighbor goes down there and he says by the time he got down there, it was so much in flames that you could actually see through the house. The sides were burnt through. And he turned to Oliver and he said, "Did your mom and dad and your brother get out?" Oliver said, "Yes." He said about the time he asked him that, he looks and he sees what looked like their bodies falling into the basement. Also, he sees what looks like liquid fire flowing into the basement. Now he tells all this stuff to the police. The police investigate and they think this is what happened. There's more, let's put it this way, there's more to convict him than there was Dayton Slim. Because they found out the week before, Oliver had told a friend of his, "I found out my dad's gonna write me out of the will and leave everything to my brother." He says, "I'm not gonna let that happen." First clue. Second clue, he's supposedly gotten his mom in an argument with his mom the week before because they would normally buy 2 gallons of coal oil. He wanted her to buy 5 gallons of coal oil. And hence the liquid flames that you saw going in. Now, what they think happened was he put drugs in their food at supper. They keeled over. He laid them in their beds, fully clothed, waited till later on, put the coal oil all around the house, lit it on fire and left. I mean, there are some other things that are kind of strange. For instance, the body of the mother, what remains were there. They found her jewelry, like her earrings and her necklace, which I don't think most women go to bed with all the jewelry on, do they? Which was kind of weird. Their bodies were so destroyed, they actually put all 3 bodies in a box about this big. And the daughter-in-law actually had them buried down there. Oliver went to the High State Penitentiary, was electrocuted, and his body's over in Columbus right now. But that's the story of Oliver Ha. Now, what's the rest of the story? Now, this is all speculation. Remember I told you about Dayton had those 5 murders of young girls? Around the same time period, Cincinnati had the same thing. And they called that the Cincinnati Ripper. Maybe it's coincidence, but after Oliver was arrested, there were no more murders like that in Dayton or Cincinnati. Could be just coincidence, but as crazy as that guy was, who knows? 600 Civil War soldiers, both Confederate and Union, 600 World War I soldiers, 1,200 World War II soldiers. Most of these soldiers are probably officers. because what would happen is morticians would go along with the armies. If an officer died, they would embalm their body and send them home. So like privates, corporals, and sergeants were buried on the battleground where they fought, unless the family had made prior arrangements to have their bodies embalmed. And it was after the Civil War then, from embalming those bodies, that became more of a custom then to embalm bodies, because that wasn't necessarily done before the Civil War. Okay, the Huffman family is buried in this crypt. The Huffmans were early settlers of Dayton, but what I'm interested in are the two sons of William Huffman. The one son owned Huffman Prairie, which is near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, is where the Wright brothers really learned how to fly. I mean, come on, at Kitty Hawk, all they did was go up and down. That was it. And for just a little over a minute. At the Huffman Prairie, they learned to do circles, figure eights, stayed up for like 40, 45 minutes. So that's really, and the son owned it. The only stipulation he had is just chase the cows off the field before you use it. Their other son owned Huffy Bicycle Company. And I grew up riding a Huffy bicycle, so I find that interesting.